know, there's something about autumn that just gets me every year. Maybe it's that damp air or those foggy mornings that, tell you the world is winding down for a bit. Or maybe it's the colors, those deep, dramatic reds and moody golds, those long shadows that make even the mundane look cinematic. This is the season that feels like a storyteller's dream. It's the perfect backdrop for reflection, for all those late night thoughts about where we've been and where we are going, and whether we actually know what the hell we're doing in between. So, as the world gets a little colder, and the trees shed their leaves, I thought this might be the right time to take a long and honest look back at my own creative journey. Let's take a look at how it started, what I've learned, and all the strange and wonderful and occasionally painful lessons that came with trying to turn a passion for art into something resembling a career. But before we dig into all of that, the nostalgia, the chaos, and the self-inflicted deadlines, I should probably do the YouTuber thing. So, if you like hanging out here, and if you enjoy art and storytelling, and watching me try to make sense of both, don't forget to like and subscribe, and maybe hit that little bell button so you don't miss any future videos. And hey, if you want to take it one step further, go ahead and check out my Patreon. Because patrons get early access to new projects, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and we've been slowly building this wonderful little Discord community of fellow artists and story lovers. Plus, there is some exclusive merch waiting for a few specific tiers. Think of it as a small thank you for helping me keep the lights on and the paint flowing. Alright, shameless plug over. Welcome back to another Butcher Shop. Once upon a time, which sounds romantic, but really it kinda just means 4 years ago, I decided to take my art seriously. Like, actually seriously. Before that, it's always been something that I did because I loved it. It was a creative outlet, a way to survive the chaos of, normal life. And even though that is still the case, because I believe that you can't make art into a career if you don't love what you're doing, trying to commercialize my art has been a wild ride of lessons learned and inspiration found. The first big project that came out of this decision was a project called the Singularian. It started as a series of illustrated short stories, formatted into monthly episodes, like a visual anthology of some sort. On paper, it was a great idea. In reality, well, let's just say it was very ambitious. Each month, I was juggling writing and illustrating, layout design, storytelling, and God knows what else to deliver the next episode. It was very hard work, of which I knew it was never really going to be seen by many people because who was I? I had a platform of roughly 3 fans. Shout out to you guys because I still freaking love you. But I knew that nothing, I knew nothing about marketing, or branding or whatever else you need to sort of get out there. And you know what? I think because of that, I spent my full 100% on the actual work that I delivered. I think the way this all turned out was an excellent step into where I wanted to go as an artist and storyteller, even though it was sort of bound to fail because of its format, It was beautiful, but it wasn't built to grow. It was just built to be there. In a way, it reminds me of, one of those houseplants that looks great in a tiny pot, But eventually it sort of chokes on itself because it has no room to spread out some roots. And I think that also happened with the Singularian after 1.5 or 2 years. It kind of hit that invisible wall between what was artistically fulfilling and what was sustainable long term. And that's a fun realization to have when you've already burned through half of your sanity trying to make something work. The funny thing is, though, that after 2 years, when I finished, the whole of the story, the pieces that I released as episodes, I released them as paperback novels instead. And so now, 2 years later, I've currently sold about 800 copies of those paperbacks. Which really, to be honest, is not that bad for a first try. But even this should be a heads up of where I want to go throughout the rest of this video. It started somewhere and it felt like failure, but given time and patience, things tend to turn into something. It'll work. It'll show you it's hard. And to be honest, the whole Singularian project was the first time I looked at my work and thought, okay, well maybe I can actually do this. Right? So it wasn't a total loss. Even though it didn't feel like it was something very successful at the time. Every project, and even those that feel like dead ends, teaches you something. And for me, that Singularian project taught me discipline and it taught me structure. It forced me to finish things instead of endlessly tinkering with them, in some sort of digital purgatory. And most importantly, it gave me the confidence to say, okay, what's next? And that next step turned out to be the Technomancer. That was an illustrated collaboration with my buddy MK Gibson. Go ahead and check out his books. I promise you won't regret it. Working with someone else, especially another creative, changes everything. Suddenly you're not just drawing for yourself, you're trying to bring someone else's words to life. You're interpreting their world and their tone and their characters. It almost feels like translating a language you both sort of speak, but pronounce completely differently. Which was very much the case in real life as well, because my English obviously has a very European accent to it, whereas, Gib speaks real American. So we laughed really hard whenever I was at a loss for words, literally. But anyway, it was awesome to take this on as my first commissioned work. Working on Technomancer pushed me further than I thought I could go. I saw that, my scenes became more complex. My compositions grew bolder. My lighting, became more intentional. My visual storytelling generally became sharper. I started to understand the rhythm of an illustration, how it could sort of breathe like a sentence, how shadows could act like punctuation, and how color, or in my case, the lack of that, could drive emotion. And I think this project sort of was a turning point for me, because I realized that it wasn't just about making pretty pictures anymore. It was very much about communicating, about a narrative. Every line started to carry meaning, and every detail had to become something very deliberate. This was no longer about just drawing characters. I was directing scenes, and that was really freaking awesome. But fast forward to 2022, and somewhere along the line, I decided to throw myself into full color. which, at the time felt like felt like volunteering for artistic torture. Because up until then, I'd been living very comfortably in the world of monochrome images and drawings. Shadows, line work, texture, all of that, but no color. And I felt like I spoke the language of black and white images fluently at this point. But color? Not so much. I think at that point, the last time I touched color was when I was still at the Art Academy, which is longer. That's a longer time ago than I care to admit at this point. So yeah, color is a whole different beast. It's emotional, it's unpredictable. And so I introduced myself to color very gently, because that's how I am. There's no way, I start with something incredibly detailed, using clair-obscur color palettes or outspoken light sources and God rays, right? Nah, that totally does not sound like me. Of course, my first full color piece had all of that. There is no try, only do. That kind of was the motto behind everything that I did. Even in the illustration you're looking at right now, I wanted to go all out with the light effects, and the bioluminescence of this autumn scene. But, back to the subject. That first full color illustration was a piece called Matthias. And it was a little monk mouse inspired by the Redwall novels, which I highly recommend whether you are a kid or an adult. Read those books, they're absolutely amazing. But Matthias was my first real experiment into bringing warmth and light into my work. And I remember that first piece so vividly. I sat there completely intimidated by the color wheel, thinking, there's no way I'm not going to screw this up. And spoilers, I did screw up, repeatedly. But somehow I think that was the point. I worked on one single layer, like I would have when working on canvas. Whenever I messed something up, I'd have to redo large parts of the whole thing. The anatomy was still a bit clunky, and everything was flattened out and smoothened to hell with a blender brush. But working with color, I think, also opened up something in me. It gave me permission to play again, to experiment and to make a mess. And I actually talked about this in a video some weeks ago, so if you want to know more about why it's actually important, to keep experimenting with your work, go ahead and check that video out. But Matthias might have been a very small project. He was the start of something much, much bigger. He was a shift in how I saw my world and my career as an artist, but also very much as a storyteller. Because after him, I don't think I've ever looked at light and shadow the same way again. Now, looking back at all of this, from the Singularian to Technomancer to Little Matthias, now I can see a very clear pattern of improvement, but here's the kicker. I didn't really see it back then. When I was in the middle of it, everything just felt like a grind. Like I was moving in circles instead of forward. You know that feeling? You pour your soul into something, and when you step back, you can only see the flaws. You think, shouldn't I be better by now? Or shouldn't this feel easier? It's like watching a tree grow, really. You don't really notice the change until someday you look up and realize that tree is towering over you. And it wasn't until recently, when I went back and revisited some of my old illustrations, that I realized how far I'd come. All those textures, the storytelling, the way I use light now. All of that evolved very quietly while I was too busy worrying that I wasn't improving. And that's something I think a lot of artists struggle with, that invisible progress. It's the kind that only reveals itself years later, long after, self-doubt has already done its damage, so to speak. And that's why I think looking back at your process is so important. Not in a self-critical, oh god, what was I thinking kind of way, although that's quite inevitable, but in a way that honors where you've been. Every old sketch and every messy painting and every awkward experiment is basically a timestamp of your growth. You can't appreciate how far you've come if you're constantly sprinting towards the next thing. And in all honesty, making a career out of art kind of means you're doing just that. Because every day you don't work on art is a day your business doesn't grow. But I mean, well, that's how I thought about this. It's what I thought that meant anyway. I know better now, because a healthy art career is something completely different. Even when working on commission, sometimes it's best to pull the plug and give the assignment back than to brute force something into existence that doesn't make anyone happy. So yeah, sometimes what feels like taking a step back into your progress is actually a big leap forward. We live in a culture that's obsessed with the outcome of things. Finished pieces, portfolio spreads, a perfect Instagram carousel. But the process, the ugly, uncertain, chaotic process, that's where the real growth hides. That's the part that is actually worth celebrating. Sometimes I scroll through my old work and feel this weird mix of pride and secondhand embarrassment. Like, whoa, I can't really believe that I actually posted that. But then I remember, if I hadn't posted any of that, I would not be here today. That work was a stepping stone. You can't really skip steps on a staircase, no matter how much you want to. I mean, you can, but there's a pretty big chance you'll go face first if you trip. Another thing I've learned along the way, and this took me way longer than I like to admit, is the importance of critique partners. Not just people who say, "Oh, I love your work," although that's very nice too, but people who actually challenge you. The ones who make you a little uncomfortable in the best way possible. For a very long time, I was terrified of sharing my unfinished work. It felt like inviting people to read my diary, something like that. But eventually I found a few trusted people who could look at something and say, "Hey, this is great, but what if you push this further?" Or, this doesn't really read that clearly, maybe try it this way. And those conversations are absolute freaking gold. And even though you might end up disagreeing sometimes, or feel that person is an asshole for calling you out on the wrong color theory, these conversations sometimes hurt, let's be real. But these conversations are also very, very necessary. Because no matter how good we get at seeing your own work, you're still too close to it. We fill in gaps in our heads that the viewer can't. So a fresh pair of eyes is almost like a reality check. And sometimes that, quote unquote, a gentle slap in the face is exactly what we didn't know we needed. And when you find a critique partner who understands your goals and your tone and your artistic voice, hold on to these people. Buy them coffee, send them gifts, whatever it takes. Do not lose these folks. They are the people who will help you see the forest when you are too busy arguing with the trees. In my case, thanks Gib for being there and for always trying to remind me that you are right, even though you're not always right. But if you are, I will admit it. But thanks for being a cool art buddy. Thanks. I mean, of course, not every lesson is that noble. You know, some of these lessons are just painful. It's like learning to manage a burnout, or realizing that doing what you love doesn't automatically mean that you never feel tired of it. There were weeks, sometimes months, where I'd stare at my sketchbook and feel nothing but static. And then I'd feel guilty for feeling that way, which is also almost a lot of fun. But you know what? Burnout is a signal, not a failure. It's your brain saying, hey, maybe stop trying to sprint this marathon. Sometimes, like I said before, stepping back is the most productive thing you can do. Go for a walk, read something unrelated, make something terrible on purpose. That's my personal favorite because I freaking hate making something ugly. I get shivers thinking of it. But it's actually a very good challenge whenever I'm stuck. Just do something and make it exist. Half my favorite pieces come from moments when I stopped trying to make something good and just made something true instead. It's almost like that meme, you know, art is like a fart. If you have to force it, it's probably shit. And that's it's very much the truth. Learn to trust that the feeling and the vibe and the inspiration will come back to you. It might take a week or a month or a year, but it will come back to you. So don't brute force anything if you don't have that feeling. And I promise you, it'll make the moment when it'll come back even better. Since we are in this reflective autumn mood, maybe that's the best metaphor for art. It's seasonal. We have springs full of inspiration, we have summers full of momentum, autumns of reflection, and winters full of rest. Each phase is really necessary. And if you try to stay in perpetual summer, you'll burn out. If you never let yourself have an autumn, you'll forget to appreciate how far you've come. Right now, today, I am very much in my autumn phase, like literally and figuratively. Looking back at old projects, you know, preparing for what's next, quietly growing roots under the surface while the world slows down a bit. And you know what? It actually feels kind of good. There's something deeply satisfying about acknowledging your own timeline, about realizing you have earned your experience, but you've also earned some rest. And at the moment of recording, I am at the peak season of events and conventions and, you know, all kinds of weekends and days where I'm off, you know, either selling art or talking about my books and stories. And I'm so exhausted by the time that, you know, that period is over. That period being basically around Christmas, that I always take January all the way up until April off. I just need to take that time to grow my roots and to come back to me again, and to have new energy so that I can, you know, find that spring inspiration again and to spend that entire summer, you know, working on that momentum. And sure, I'll take on 1 or 2 commissions. There's a pretty cool project actually waiting for me. But generally, you have to take that time off. It is super important. And I think along the lines of that, one of the most underrated skills as an artist is learning to see yourself that clearly. Not through the lens of imposter syndrome or ego, but with honesty. Can you look at your work and say, this is where I am, and that's okay? Can you let go of where you want to be and stay where you are and enjoy the moment where you are? And I think that's harder than any technical skill, because improvement isn't really just about, getting your anatomy done or fixing your color theory. It is also very much about self-awareness. It is about knowing your strengths, your blind spots, and your habits. For example, I used to think my biggest weakness was consistency. I would look at other artists with cohesive portfolios and think, why can't I do that? But over time, I realized that my inconsistency was actually exploration. Each style shift, each experiment was a piece of that puzzle. It wasn't chaos, it was evolution. And I was trying to get all of that done in as little time as possible. So artist burnout was sort of inevitable. But I think I saw what I was doing in time to sort of prevent myself from crashing. But that self-awareness, that moment where you realize, hey, I'm always working on the next thing. And, while I'm working on the current thing, I'm already thinking about what's going to be next. So starting with that period of downtime, those 3-4 months that you need to sort of recuperate from everything you've done over the year, I think that was key in preventing myself from going burnout and not being productive anymore. So yeah, that self-awareness, that's worth your weight in gold. It's really all about understanding that evolution takes time. It can take years. And that's not something we really like to hear in the age of, viral art reels and overnight success stories. But real growth is very, very slow, and I'm pretty sure I'm not the first person to talk about this. Growth is like, the rings of a tree, or a good wine, if you will. You can't rush it, no matter how much caffeine you throw at it. Trust me, I've tried. And if you're in that stage where everything feels uncertain, where every piece feels like it's fighting you, just keep going. It's not failure, it's friction. And friction is what makes things spark. As I'm recording this, the wind outside is picking up. And the leaves are starting to really let go. And my tea is probably gone cold, which feels poetic, if not a little on brand. There is something about this time of year that makes me grateful for the process. All of it. The frustration, the breakthroughs, the endless learning cycles. Because every sketch and every late night project, every time, I have this is garbage, I quit moment, it all adds up. All of it matters. If you're watching this and you're somewhere on that same path, whether you're just starting out or, knee deep in your own creative chaos, I hope you give yourself permission to appreciate where you are, not where you think you should be. Because really, the here and now is where your story really lives. So yeah, that's my little autumn reflection. A look back at the past 4 years, all my lessons, the mistakes, the growth I didn't notice until it was staring me in the face. And as we move toward winter, toward that quiet, introspective season, I'm planning to take some of that energy with me, to keep learning and to keep experimenting, and to keep telling stories through art, one brushstroke or one panic-filled deadline at the time. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you. Seriously. These long-form videos are some of my favorite things to make, and the fact that you take some time out of your day to listen to it and to watch my art, it means more than I really can say. So if you enjoyed this, consider joining me on Patreon. You know, you'll get a lot of early access to new projects, exclusive behind the scenes updates, and a spot in our Discord community where we talk about art, share our work, and occasionally spiral out of control and into a creative block together. Plus there's exclusive merch for some of those tiers, you know, limited run prints, stickers, and a few other surprises that make supporting the channel just a little bit more personal. Until next time, and take care of yourselves, stay inspired, and don't forget to look back every once in a while, because sometimes the best way to see how far you've come is to pause and to breathe and to let the leaves fall where they may. Take care, guys. I'll see you in the next one.